This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to look at Blue Enchantments. Lately I've been making my way through enchantments of every color. I've already done black and red if you're interested in seeing how those lists shook out. To be eligible for this list, a card needed to be mono blue and an enchantment. In all, there are 641 blue enchantments, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest mark on competitive Magic. Fun fact, blue is actually the color with the second most enchantments, which surprised me. If you're like me, you assumed white and green were the two colors with the most, but nope. There are only 547 green enchantments, so green actually comes in third. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like Regional Championships. Alright, let's dive in with a look at the top 10 blue enchantments in Magic. At number 10, it's Back to Basics. One of the most well-named cards in Magic, this enchantment costs 2 generic and a blue, and it makes it so non-basic lands don't untap during their controller's untap steps. In other words, it makes both players go back to their basic lands. Obviously, this is a powerful prison effect, and it kind of works out as a blue Blood Moon, in that both are 3-mana enchantments that hate on non-basics. Mini decks, especially in non-rotating formats, heavily rely on non-basic lands, so Back to Basics can really lock those decks out of the game. Legacy has been the format where it's done the most work by far. One of the top tier decks in that format is a deck simply called Lands, which, as you can probably guess, is a deck that is all about taking advantage of powerful non-basics, and Back to Basics makes life almost impossible for those decks. Back to Basics is going to continue to see heavy play in Legacy going forward. At number 9, it's Standstill. For 1 generic and a blue, this enchantment just sits on the battlefield and does nothing, until a player casts a spell, at which point it gets sacrificed and the other player draws 3 cards. This is symmetrical, of course, so it doesn't slot into just any deck, but decks have sprung up in multiple formats over the years that have managed to make it fairly one-sided. The most famous of these are the Standstill decks that have been featured in both the Eternal formats and especially Legacy. This is actually one of the main decks that Back to Basics can hate on. Standstill decks look to play creature lands like Treetop Village and then play Standstill. If you've got a creature land or other activated abilities on the board that you can use to pressure your opponent, you put your opponent in a horrible spot. They can't not do anything, or they're going to get beaten to death by creature lands, but if they do something, you're going to get to draw 3 cards, which probably means you have enough of a card advantage to win the game. It's a real pick-your-poison scenario. Standstill decks are going to continue to be featured in Legacy and Vintage going forward. At number 8, it's Spreading Seas. For 1 generic and a blue, this enchantment is an aura with enchant land, and you draw a card when it enters the battlefield, and the enchanted land is an island. That's right, this is another blue card that's good at hosing lands. This is because it doesn't make the land it enchants into an island in addition to its other types, it just becomes an island. This can hurt your opponent's mana base, of course, but it's especially nasty when you put it on a non-basic land and shut off its sweet activated abilities. The fact that it has a cantrip built in is great too, because it means that the worst case scenario for this card is at least you're cycling it. In Standard, it was played in Control decks, where it was a great answer to all of the powerful creature lands that were in that format. In Modern, it's often been used to shut down Tron decks, and it's especially nasty in that format's Merfolk decks, which can give their whole board Island Walk. So in that deck, your opponent giving you an island can mean you lose the game on the spot. It's also made a few appearances in Extended and Legacy Merfolk. It's recently started to see significant play in Vintage, a format where 2 different non-basics have started dominating the format over the last few years, Bazaar of Baghdad and Urza's Saga. It's pretty useful tech against those insane lands, and as a result it's going to keep seeing play in the format. It's not done yet in Modern either, and it's very likely to pass the number 7 card on the list in the near future. For now though, that card is Threads of Disloyalty. For 1 generic and 2 blue, this is an aura with enchant creature with mana value 2 or less, and you gain control of that creature. Stealing an opponent's creature is among the most powerful things you can do in Magic. This is because you are effectively casting a removal spell that then gives you a creature, and that's some serious power. And sure, it is somewhat restrictive in what it can steal, but 3 mana to steal a creature is still an awesome deal. This has been especially true in formats with powerful creatures who have low mana values. In Modern, it has frequently stolen Tarmogoyfs and young Pyromancers over the years. However, it has fallen off a lot in recent years, as there are more and more super cheap creatures that don't actually have a low mana value despite being easy to cast, like Murktide Regent and Scion of Draco. Threads just doesn't have enough good targets anymore, and even when it does, spending 3 mana on it isn't nearly as good today as it used to be, and it hasn't gained any points since 2021, so it's going to slip down the list going forward. At number 6, it's Omen of the Sea. For 1 generic and a blue, this is an enchantment with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 2 and draw a card. You can also pay 2 generic and a blue and sacrifice it to scry 2. 2 mana to go 3 cards deep in your deck is a pretty good deal, especially if your deck is good at blinking permanents to get this enter the battlefield ability over and over again, and wouldn't you know it, that's exactly the kind of deck the Omen has been played in. It's gained all of its points in Yorion control decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern. Yorion is banned in Modern these days, but Omen of the Sea is going to continue to gain points in Pioneer Yorion decks in the future. At number 5, it's Counterbalance. For 2 blue mana, this enchantment triggers anytime your opponent plays a spell. When they do, you can reveal the top card of your library, and if you choose to and that card has the same mana value as the spell your opponent is casting, that spell gets countered. It may sound difficult to set this up, but it's been prominently featured in both Extended and Legacy. In both cases, Sensei's Divining Top is what unlocked its full potential. The top lets you very easily manipulate the top of your library, and because those formats had so many cheap spells, it really isn't that hard to set things up so that you can counter opposing spells a huge chunk of the time. The combo was particularly nasty once Miracles came along, because this gave you another great reason to manipulate the top of your library. The dominance of countertop decks, combined with how long games took with the deck thanks to the top's ability, led to the top getting banned in Extended, Modern, and Legacy. Counterbalance does still see play in Legacy without the top. These days it's often played in decks that use Dragon's Rage Channeler, Brainstorm, and Ponder, all of which give you some significant control over the top of your library. Counterbalance is definitely not the powerhouse it once was alongside Sensei's Divining Top, but it is still putting up top finishes in Legacy. That said, all of the cards in front of it are super active, and many of the cards behind it are more active than it is too, so it's probably never going to do better than number 5 on this list. At number 4, it's Omniscience. For 7 generic and 3 blue, this enchantment allows you to cast spells from your hand without paying their mana costs. 10 mana is a lot, of course, but if your deck has card draw effects in it, you can basically play your entire library when Omniscience comes into play, and it's pretty hard to lose the game when you do that. The 10 mana hurdle was too big for formats like Block and Standard, but there are decks in non-rotating formats that can get Omniscience into play really easily. This was first accomplished in Legacy Omni-Show decks, which put Omniscience into play with Show and Tell, and then followed that up by casting Enter the Infinite, at which point you drew your entire library and then cast everything you drew. The creation of the Pioneer format in 2019 was good news for Omniscience too, as it immediately became part of that format's Lotus Field decks, which specialize in constantly untapping that powerful land. Lotus Field decks have been good in Pioneer pretty much from day one, and they virtually always use Omniscience. This powerful enchantment is going to continue to see play in both Pioneer and Legacy, and that's not changing anytime soon, and it has some chance to move higher on this list in the future. At number 3, it's Energy Flux. For 2 generic and a blue, this enchantment gives all artifacts, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this artifact unless you pay 2 generic. This is a great way to hate on artifact decks, as it's usually impossible for artifact-heavy decks to hold on to their artifacts once this comes online. This is especially potent in Vintage, where most decks run powerful mana rocks. The tax from Energy Flux really makes sure that players aren't going to be able to come out ahead with their mana rocks, whether they're in the Power 9 or not. What's more is, there are several artifact-heavy decks in Vintage, like Mud and Shops, and this really messes them up. Vintage is where it's been played the most by far, and that's something that will continue. At number 2, it's Dress Down. For 1 generic and a blue, this enchantment has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Creatures lose all abilities, and you sacrifice Dress Down at the beginning of the end step. It's pretty amazing to shut down all creature abilities for an entire turn, especially at instant speed, and especially when you get to draw a card. It's from Modern Horizons too, so when it comes to 60-card formats, the only ones it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, but Dress Down is plenty powerful for all of those formats, so it hasn't held it back very much, as evidenced by the fact that it's only a few years old and comes in at number 2 on this list. These days, abilities are almost always what makes a creature good, so shutting them down can be a big deal, especially if they're enter the battlefield abilities, since those generally only trigger one time in most cases anyway, and Dress Down can stop them at instant speed. There are tons of important other Dress Down interactions too. Here are a few of the more notable ones. If you cast it in response to an opposing Walking Ballista, the Ballista comes into play as a 0/0 and dies. If you cast it in response to an Evoke Elemental Incarnation like Grief, you can stop its enter the battlefield ability, but that also means it won't get sacrificed if it was evoked. It's also pretty sweet against Primeval Titan decks, as shutting down the enter the battlefield and attack trigger for a turn is often enough to completely derail their game plan. In addition to using it to hate on your opponent's stuff, you can also use it to benefit you. For example, playing Dress Down in your Death Shadow deck means you can make it a 13/13 out of nowhere. Dress Down has many more uses, and this is what has led to it being heavily played in every single format it's legal in. It's worthwhile to have a few somewhere in your 75 and blue decks in all three formats, and that means Dress Down has a ton of potential to gain more points in the future, but the card in front of it has a huge lead and is also heavily played, and that card is Shark Typhoon. For 5 generic and a blue, this enchantment triggers whenever you cast a non-creature spell, giving you an XX blue shark creature token with flying, where X is the mana value of the spell. It also has cycling for X1 and a blue. This means you can pay that cost and discard it to draw a card, and the Typhoon also gives you an XX blue shark with flying anytime you cycle it. This card is cycled far more often than it's cast as an enchantment. This is because getting an instant speed, nigh uncounterable flying creature that draws you a card is really good. The Typhoon has seen play in every format it's been legal in since being printed, and generally in control decks. It was especially dominant in both standard and historic, as there were multiple top tier events where every top 8 deck or almost every top 8 deck was packing the Typhoon. Its greatest stretch of dominance came in Wilderness Reclamation decks, which had tons of ramp, including the Reclamation, which could effectively double your mana as long as you were doing stuff at instant speed, and cycling the Typhoon was one of the better things you could do with all of that mana. All 8 decks in the top 8 of Players Tour Online 1 in 2020 played the Typhoon, and the same is true at Players Tour Online 3 later that year. Eventually, Reclamation got banned, but Shark Typhoon continued to be heavily featured in the format's control decks. While it's never achieved quite that level of dominance in other formats, it is virtually a staple in control decks in Pioneer and Modern, and it's also used in the Legacy Landstill decks I mentioned earlier, as it combines nicely with Standstill. Cycling the Typhoon doesn't count as casting a spell, and that means you can pressure your opponent with a huge flyer that they have to do something about, which means you'll get to draw 3 off of your Standstill. The Typhoon is going to continue to put up top finishes at major events, and I think it has a good shot at maintaining its number 1 spot on this list going forward, although Dress Down may give it a run for its money. So, those are the top 10 blue enchantments. If you want to own any of these powerful cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at enchantments in each color, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.